In an atmosphere thick with taunts, bullies mock the new Mexican kid, unaware that behind his calm exterior lies a brutal and fearless fighter. When his true strength emerges, the scene takes an unexpected turn, leaving his tormentors utterly shocked and regretful. Eduardo's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the wooden desk. The whispering had stopped, and now 30 pairs of eyes were fixed on him with various degrees of curiosity, pity, and undisguised disdain. Mrs. Patterson, her chalk, still poised mid-equation, repeated herself with the slow, exaggerated enunciation people reserve for those they assume don't understand English. "I asked if you could solve this problem for us, Eduardo." He knew the answer. Differential equations had been his refuge during those long nights in Mexico when his father's arguments with his mother made sleep impossible. But now, standing before the sea of unfamiliar faces in this American high school math class, the symbols on the board seemed to swim and rearrange themselves. "Dato," he began, his accent thicker than usual under the weight of their stares. From the back of the room came a stage whisper. "Guess they don't teach math where he's from." Scattered laughter rippled through the classroom. Mrs. Patterson's lips thinned, but she didn't address it. Eduardo felt a familiar heat rising from his collar, not embarrassment, but the quiet rage he'd promised his mother he would control in America. The same rage that had gotten him expelled from his previous school after a fight that had escalated far beyond what he'd intended. His fingers itched to grab the nearest textbook and hurl it at the smirking blonde boy in the Letterman jacket, Jenkins, captain of the wrestling team and self-appointed tormentor since Eduardo's arrival 3 weeks ago. Instead, he forced himself to pick up the chalk, his movements deliberate and measured. The equation wasn't just manageable, it was elementary. Eduardo solved it with a few deft strokes, adding an elegant proof that extended beyond what the teacher had asked for. Then, without waiting for Mrs. Patterson's reaction, he returned to his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "That's very good, Eduardo," Mrs. Patterson said, sounding genuinely surprised. "In fact, I haven't seen that approach before." The silence in the classroom had shifted. He could feel it, a subtle recalibration of assumptions. Then came the first seismic tremor of what would eventually crack this town wide open. Jenkins' voice louder now. "Lucky guess, or maybe he cheated. Probably copied it from some book." Eduardo was halfway to Jenkins' desk before he even realized he'd moved. His body had made the decision before his mind could intervene. One heartbeat. He was seated. The next, he was towering over Jenkins, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes widen with alarm. "Say it to my face," Eduardo whispered, soft enough that only Jenkins and perhaps Sophia in the neighboring desk could hear. "Not behind my back. Say it to my face." Jenkins' confidence faltered for just a moment, then reasserted itself when he remembered where they were, surrounded by his teammates and admirers. "Back off, border boy," he sneered, rising from his seat until they were chest to chest. Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the tension like a dull knife. "Boys, that's enough." But both knew it wasn't nearly enough. This confrontation had been building since Eduardo's first day, and now it had critical mass. "Mr. Alvarez, Mr. Jenkins, principal's office now." Eduardo stepped back first, not out of submission but strategy. He'd learned from his mistakes in Mexico. This wasn't the time or place, but as he gathered his books, he looked directly at Jenkins and allowed himself the ghost of a smile, the kind that promised this was merely postponed, not prevented. What neither boy realized as they stalked out of the classroom under Mrs. Patterson's glare was that their collision course was set to alter not just their own lives, but the fragile ecosystem of their high school and the town itself. 6 months earlier, Eduardo Alvarez had been someone else entirely. He'd been the top student at his school in Mexico, quietly brilliant but largely invisible by choice. His father worked as a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant, instilling in Eduardo both a love for mathematics and a soldier's discipline. His mother taught literature at the local university, nurturing his other passion, poetry, which he wrote late at night and shared with no one. Their home had been modest but sufficient, filled with books and heated discussions about politics, science, and art. It was imperfect but stable, until the day the cartel moved into their neighborhood, and Eduardo refused to pay protection money for his small auto repair side business. The warning came first, a dead cat on their doorstep. Then Eduardo's workshop was vandalized. When that didn't persuade him, 3 men cornered Miguel after school, delivered a beating that left him with 2 cracked ribs, and promised worse would follow. Instead of cowering, Eduardo went to the police, a critical miscalculation in a department where half the officers were on cartel payroll. That night, Miguel watched through swollen eyes as his father packed their essential belongings into 2 suitcases. "We're visiting your Tío Carlos in Ohio," Eduardo announced, his voice carefully modulated to project calm. Just for a while until things settle. Miguel wasn't fooled. The one-way tickets to Columbus that his mother clutched said everything. 3 days later, they crossed the border legally. Eduardo's dual citizenship and steady employment history had secured green cards for the family years earlier, but it felt like exile nonetheless. Miguel left behind his friends, his school, his carefully constructed identity, and stepped into a void. Tío Carlos lived in Riversend, a former manufacturing hub struggling to reinvent itself after the steel mill closed. The town existed in that uniquely American state of stubborn pride and quiet desperation, its population roughly divided between those who remembered prosperity and those who had only heard about it. Carlos had done well for himself, managing the engineering department at the town's remaining factory. He welcomed them into his spacious home with genuine warmth, but Miguel felt the weight of their dependence immediately. His father, stripped of his professional credentials in the US, took a job as a mechanic at the local garage. His mother, whose English was more academic than conversational, found part-time work at the public library. "It's temporary," became the family mantra, though none of them truly believed it anymore. Miguel's enrollment at Lakeside High was supposed to be the silver lining. American education, better opportunities, a fresh start. On paper, at least. Reality proved harsher. Despite testing into advanced placement courses, Miguel found himself treated as intellectually suspect by teachers and students alike. His accent, though mild, became a target for mockery. The casual racism wasn't always overt. Sometimes it was just the slight surprise when he knew an answer, or the assumption that he'd excel at soccer rather than chess club. Tyler Reed emerged as the physical embodiment of this ambient hostility. The wrestling champion came from Riversend royalty, 3 generations of mill managers who'd transitioned to local politics when manufacturing declined. His father now served as mayor, his mother chaired half the town's committees. Tyler had been raised on a steady diet of entitlement and thinly veiled xenophobia, disguised as concern for American jobs. Their first encounter had happened in the cafeteria, 1 week after Miguel's arrival. He'd been sitting alone, annotating his copy of Garcia Marquez, when Tyler and 2 teammates deposited their trays at his table. "So," Tyler had said without preamble, "you're the Mexican." Miguel had looked up slowly. "I'm Miguel Alvarez," he'd corrected. "Right, the Mexican." Tyler's smile hadn't reached his eyes. "My dad says your people are the reason the mill closed. Cheaper labor south of the border." Miguel had chosen silence, turning back to his book, a response that infuriated Tyler more than any retort could have. The confrontation might have escalated if Coach Winters hadn't walked by at that moment. In the weeks that followed, Tyler's campaign of intimidation grew more sophisticated. Someone scrawled "Go home" on Miguel's locker. His gym clothes mysteriously vanished during PE. Anonymous notes appeared in his textbooks, ranging from crude drawings to threats specific enough to indicate surveillance. Miguel kept all of it, from his parents, who were weathering their own adjustments. His father came home with grease embedded so deeply in his hands that no amount of scrubbing removed it completely. His mother's confident stride had shortened, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if perpetually apologizing for her existence. The only bright spot was Eliza Chen, who shared 4 of his AP classes and seemed immune to the town's tacit agreement to keep Miguel isolated. The daughter of Riversend's only Chinese-American doctor, she occupied a liminal space in the social hierarchy. respected for her family's status, but never fully embraced. 2 weeks ago, she'd approached him in the library. "Your proof in calculus." "Yesterday was elegant," she'd said without introduction, sliding into the chair across from him. Mrs. Patterson didn't understand it, by the way. She looked it up after class. Miguel had blinked, unsure how to respond to this unexpected alliance. "I'm Eliza," she continued, extending her hand formally, "and you should know that Tyler's planning something. He doesn't like being shown up intellectually, especially not by—" She'd stopped herself. "Especially not by the Mexican." Miguel had finished for her. Eliza had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Riversend has a limited worldview," she'd said diplomatically. "My family's been here 20 years, and we're still the Chens rather than just people." That conversation had formed a tentative friendship, the first genuine connection Miguel had made in Riversend. It also marked the moment he decided to stop being invisible, to stop absorbing Tyler's provocations like a silent sponge, which led directly to today's confrontation in Mrs. Patterson's classroom, and the two of them sitting outside Principal Warner's office, separated by 3 empty chairs and an ocean of mutual animosity. "Suspended? Both of us?" Tyler's indignation echoed down the empty corridor. "For what?" Principal Warner, a man whose jowls seemed perpetually on the verge of overtaking his collar, fixed Tyler with a weary stare. "For disrupting class and creating a threatening environment." "I didn't threaten anyone," Tyler protested, shooting a venomous glance at Miguel. "He's the one who got in my face." "After you suggested I cheated," Miguel said quietly, his calm in stark contrast to Tyler's agitation. "Mr. Reed, Mr. Alvarez," Principal Warner sighed, folding his hands on his desk. "This is the 3rd incident between you two this month. I've spoken with Mrs. Patterson and several other students. This stops now." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew 2 forms. 3 days suspension for both of you, and when you return, you'll be working together on the Spring Community Project. "What?" The word exploded simultaneously from both boys. "You heard me. The town council approved the restoration of the old Riverside Park, and student volunteers are handling the initial cleanup. You two will be partners." Principal Warner's expression hardened. "And if I hear of any problems, that suspension becomes permanent. Am I clear?" Miguel nodded stiffly while Tyler sputtered ineffectually. "This is absurd," Tyler finally managed. "My father has already been called and agrees with my decision," Principal Warner cut him off. "In fact, as mayor, he's particularly interested in the park project's success. He suggested your participation himself." The look of betrayal on Tyler's face would have been comical under different circumstances. Miguel felt a twinge of vindication, quickly followed by dread at the prospect of forced collaboration with his tormentor. Outside the office, Tyler rounded on him. "This is your fault," he hissed. "You've been playing the victim, turning teachers against me." Miguel met his gaze, steadily. "I haven't said a word about you to anyone." "Right," Tyler scoffed. "The perfect martyr. Well, listen carefully. Suspension or not, community project or not, you don't belong here. And I'm not the only one who thinks so." He stalked away, leaving Miguel to wonder if the threat was as collective as Tyler implied. The answer came 3 hours later as Miguel walked home alone, taking the route through Maple Street that added 10 minutes to his journey but avoided the usual hangouts of Tyler's friends. The black SUV appeared from nowhere, slowing to match his pace. Miguel tensed, ready to run, when the passenger window rolled down to reveal Coach Winters. "Get in, Alvarez," the coach said, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk." Against his better judgment, Miguel complied. They drove in silence until, reaching Riverside Park, the very location he and Tyler would soon be tasked with rehabilitating. Currently, it was a shambles of overgrown paths and vandalized benches, the playground equipment rusted and condemned. Coach Winters parked near the dilapidated gazebo and turned off the engine. "I heard about what happened today," he said finally. "And about your suspension." Miguel waited, sensing there was more. "I also know about the locker vandalism, the missing gym clothes, the notes. I know Tyler Reed is behind most of it, probably with help from some teammates. The coach ran a hand over his closely cropped hair. "What I don't know is why you haven't reported any of it." The question caught Miguel off guard. Would it have made a difference? Coach Winters had the integrity to consider this before answering. Maybe not immediately. The Reed family has influence here. But documentation creates patterns, and patterns can't be ignored forever. Miguel stared out at the neglected park. "In Mexico, I made the mistake of fighting back. One boy ended up hospitalized. I was expelled." He paused. "I promised my mother it wouldn't happen again." "So you've been taking it," Coach Winters concluded. "All of it." "I've been observing," Miguel corrected, "learning the terrain." Something in his tone made the coach look at him more closely. "Just be careful that observing doesn't become an excuse for becoming a target. There's a difference between pacifism and passivity." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. "I've seen you running in the mornings," Coach Winters said eventually. "You've got good form. Ever consider track?" Miguel shook his head. "I prefer boxing, actually. My father taught me." The coach's eyebrows rose slightly. "We don't have a boxing program, but we do have a mixed martial arts club that meets after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Might be a constructive outlet." When Miguel didn't immediately respond, Coach Winters added, "Just consider it, and know that not everyone in Riversend shares Tyler's views. Some of us remember being the newcomers once." As they drove back to the main road, Miguel found himself reconsidering his strategy of invisibility. Perhaps there were allies to be found, bridges to be built. The thought was simultaneously hopeful and exhausting. His phone vibrated with a text message. "Unknown number. Meet at Chen's Pharmacy, 7 p.m. Might help with your situation." Eliza. Another potential ally or something more complex? Chen's Pharmacy occupied the corner of Main and Walnut, its green neon sign one of the few consistently lit storefronts in downtown Riversend. Miguel arrived 5 minutes early, hesitating outside until he spotted Eliza through the window, sitting at the vintage soda counter with an older man he didn't recognize. The bell above the door announced his entry. Eliza looked up with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miguel," she greeted him, sliding off her stool. "This is my grandfather, Dr. Henry Chen. He wanted to meet you." Dr. Chen was in his 70s, rail-thin with alert eyes that evaluated Miguel with unnerving thoroughness. "So you're the boy causing all the commotion," he said, his accent less pronounced than Miguel had expected. "I'm not trying to cause anything," Miguel replied carefully. "Intention is irrelevant. Effect is what matters." Dr. Chen gestured to the stool beside him. "Sit. My granddaughter thinks you're worth helping. I'm less convinced." Eliza shot her grandfather an exasperated look. "Ye, we talked about this." "Yes, and I agreed to listen, not to coddle." He turned back to Miguel. "You've been suspended for confronting Tyler Reed. Not your first altercation with him, I understand." Miguel glanced at Eliza, who looked apologetic. "I've told my grandfather everything I know," she admitted. "He has historical perspective." Dr. Chen's thin lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "I came to Riversend in 1978 to run this pharmacy after my brother died. William Chen. He Americanized his name in medical school. The town didn't want a Chinese doctor then, either." "Ye faced similar problems when he first arrived," Eliza explained, "and again when my parents moved here." "Cycles," Dr. Chen nodded. "This town runs on cycles of fear. The mill employed 3,000 people once. Now the factory has maybe 400 workers. People need someone to blame. And I'm convenient," Miguel concluded. "You're visible," Dr. Chen corrected, "and you've handled it poorly so far." Miguel bristled. "I've been restraining myself." "No, you've been containing yourself, like a pressure cooker. That's not restraint, it's postponement." The old man's gaze was uncomfortably penetrating. "You want to fight, but you're afraid of becoming what they already think you are." The assessment was so accurate that Miguel could only stare. "What my grandfather is trying to say," Eliza interjected, shooting the old man a warning look, "is that there might be a better approach than either fighting or enduring in silence." reached under the counter and produced a folder. "We've been documenting incidents of harassment at Lakeside for the past 3 years. Not just against international students or minorities, though that's most of it, but also against LGBTQ kids, the economically disadvantaged, anyone who doesn't fit Riversend's narrow definition of normal." Miguel opened the folder to find meticulous records, dates, times, descriptions, witness names, photographs of vandalism and injuries. Some entries had teacher signatures as witnesses. "Tyler's name appears 17 times, Eliza noted, but he's just the most visible symptom. The problem is institutional." "What exactly are you doing with this information?" Miguel asked, turning. Pages with growing astonishment. Dr. Chen and Eliza exchanged glances. "Next month, the school board reviews Principal Warner's contract," Eliza explained. "He's been silencing complaints for years to maintain Lakeside's reputation. We're presenting this documentation to force accountability." "We need more current testimony," Dr. Chen added, "and yours would be particularly compelling, Miguel." Closed the folder. "You want me to publicly accuse Tyler Reed?" "We want you to tell the truth," Eliza corrected. "On record. With evidence," Dr. Chen emphasized. "The notes, photographs of your vandalized locker, anything you've kept." Miguel thought of the small box, hidden beneath his bed, containing every scrap of harassment he'd endured since arriving. He'd been saving it all, though for what purpose, he hadn't been entirely sure. Why would the school board listen now, when they've ignored all this? He gestured at the folder. "Because 3 parents have threatened legal action," Dr. Chen said simply, "including Dr. Patel, whose son was hospitalized after a wrestling accident last year. The board can't afford a lawsuit or the publicity it would bring." Miguel felt a familiar sensation, the crossroads moment, the point of no return. "I need to think about this," he said finally. Eliza nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Take your time, but not too much. The board meets next Thursday." As Miguel left the pharmacy, the weight of their proposal settled on his shoulders alongside his existing burdens. Bearing witness meant exposure, vulnerability. It meant potentially making his family's situation even more precarious. And yet silence had solved nothing. Containment was failing. Perhaps a different kind of courage was required now. The first day of the park cleanup project dawned, chilly and overcast. Miguel arrived early, surveying the neglected space with fresh eyes. The park had once been Riversend's crown jewel, 5 acres along the river, with picnic areas, playgrounds, and a bandstand for summer concerts. Now it was a testament to the town's decline. Tyler arrived 15 minutes late, deliberately parking, his gleaming pickup truck as far from Miguel as possible. He emerged wearing work gloves and an expression of pure resentment. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, grabbing a trash bag from the supply pile. They worked in hostile silence. For the first hour, cleaning separate areas of the park, Miguel focused on the playground, removing broken glass and rusted metal from around the swing sets. Tyler tackled the picnic area, hauling away years of accumulated debris. By mid-morning, dark clouds had gathered, and the air smelled of impending rain. Miguel had just finished securing a loose board on the gazebo when Tyler approached, his body language tense but not overtly aggressive. "We need to move the stack of old lumber before it starts raining," he said stiffly. "I can't do it alone." Miguel nodded, and they moved toward the pile of rotting boards that had once been park benches. Working together required a grudging coordination, each anticipating the other's movements to balance the awkward load. They had nearly reached the dumpster when Tyler slipped on mud, stumbling backward. Miguel instinctively lunged to stabilize him, dropping his end of the boards in the process. The entire stack collapsed between them, narrowly missing Tyler's leg. "What the hell?" Tyler shouted, jumping back. "You did that on purpose." "I was trying to help you," Miguel countered, his patience finally fraying, "which is more than you've ever done for me." "Help me?" Tyler's laugh was caustic. "Right. Just like you're helping by turning the teachers against me? By making me look bad?" "You don't need my help for that," Miguel snapped. Tyler's face flushed, You think you're so much better than everyone here, with your fancy math skills and your, he gestured vaguely, attitude. My attitude? Miguel felt something inside him shift, like tectonic plates finally slipping into devastating alignment. You've tormented me since the day I arrived. You vandalized my locker, stole my clothes, left threatening notes. And I have the attitude. Problem? Thunder rumbled overhead, a fitting accompaniment to the storm breaking between them. I never touched your locker, Tyler said, his brow furrowing in what appeared to be genuine confusion. The notes, yeah, that was me. And I told Jenkins to hide your gym clothes, but I didn't vandalize anything. Miguel studied him, searching for the lie. Then who wrote "Go home" on my locker? Who broke into it and ripped up my history essay? Not me, Tyler insisted. That's not, I wouldn't. He stopped, realization dawning. Jenkins and Carter. They said they were just messing with you. Messing with me? Miguel's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Do you have any idea what my family left behind? What we lost? And for what? To come here and be treated like criminals, like we're less than human? He stepped closer, years of contained rage bubbling to the surface. You know nothing about me, nothing about my life, but you decided I was your enemy the moment you saw me. Tyler backed up, his earlier bravado faltering in the face of Miguel's controlled fury. Look, I didn't... Save it, Miguel cut him off. I don't need your excuses. I need you and your friends to leave me alone. I need to get through the next 2 years so I can get out of this town and never look back. The first fat raindrops began to fall, spattering the dirt between them. You're right, Tyler said suddenly. Miguel blinked, certain he'd misheard. You're right, Tyler repeated, looking almost as surprised by the admission as Miguel felt. I don't know anything about you. It was easy to blame you for everything that's wrong here. The rain intensified, soaking through, their clothes washing away the grime of their labor and perhaps something more. My dad lost his management position at the mill 10 years ago, Tyler continued, words spilling out now. He ran for mayor on a platform of bringing jobs back, stopping outsourcing to Mexico. It's all he talks about at home, all anyone talks about here. Miguel said nothing, wary of this unexpected confession. I'm not saying it's an excuse, Tyler added, just context, I guess. A longer silence stretched between them, filled only by the patter of rain. We should get under the gazebo, Miguel said finally. Finish this conversation out of the rain. They jogged to the shelter, both dripping wet and shivering slightly. I still don't like you, Tyler said bluntly, once they'd settled on opposite benches. Despite everything, Miguel found himself smiling. I don't like you either. But I didn't authorize what Jenkins and Carter did, and I'll tell them to back off. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an acknowledgement, which felt like the first crack in a very thick wall. I'm testifying at the school board meeting next week, Miguel said, making the decision as the words left his mouth. About the harassment. All of it. Tyler's expression hardened. You're going after Warner. I'm telling the truth, Miguel corrected, about a pattern of behavior that the administration has ignored. My father sits on that board, Tyler warned. I know. Rain drummed on the gazebo roof, creating a strange intimacy in their shelter as the rest of the world disappeared behind curtains of water. It won't change anything, Tyler said eventually. This town, it doesn't change easily. Miguel thought of Dr. Chen, of Eliza, of Coach Winters. Maybe it's time it did. When the rain finally slackened, they returned to work, not as friends or even allies, but as two people who had glimpsed each other's humanity, however briefly. It wasn't resolution. The damage between them ran too deep for that, but it was a step away from blind animosity. As they parted ways that afternoon, Tyler hesitated beside his truck. For what it's worth, he said awkwardly, you're a good math tutor. Mrs. Patterson mentioned you're helping some of the juniors after school. Miguel nodded, surprised Tyler had noticed. My sister's struggling with calculus, Tyler continued, not quite meeting Miguel's eyes. She's too proud to ask for help, but maybe if there was a group session or something. The request, indirect as it was, felt monumental. "Thursdays at 3, Miguel replied. "In the library. Anyone's welcome." Tyler nodded once and drove away, leaving Miguel to wonder if what had transpired was the beginning of a thaw or simply a momentary ceasefire in a conflict with no real resolution. And the school board meeting had been in session for over an hour when Miguel's name was finally called. The lecture hall was packed with parents, teachers, and community members, an unusual turnout for what was typically a sparsely attended procedural event. Mayor Reed sat at the center of the board table, his expression carefully neutral as Miguel approached the podium. Principal Warner, seated in the front row, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Miguel placed his documentation on the lectern, printouts of threatening notes, photographs of his vandalized locker, a detailed timeline of incidents. His hands were steady, but his heart raced as he surveyed the room. He spotted his parents near the back, his mother clutching his father's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Dr. Chen and Eliza sat closer to the front, alongside several other families Miguel recognized from their documentation folder. Coach Winters stood against the wall, arms crossed, and there, surprisingly, was Tyler Reed, slouched in a chair near the exit, pointedly not looking at his father. Miguel cleared his throat. "My name is Miguel Alvarez," he began, his accent less pronounced than it had been that first day in Mrs. Patterson's class. "I moved to Riverside 6 months ago from Oaxaca, Mexico. Since then, I have been subject to consistent harassment at Lakeside High School." He proceeded methodically through his evidence, describing each incident in clinical detail. The room grew increasingly still as he spoke, the weight of his testimony hanging in the air. "I am not the only student who has experienced this," he continued, nodding toward Eliza, who stood and distributed copies of their compiled documentation to each board member. "This folder contains 3 years of similar incidents, affecting 27 students. Many of them are here tonight." Mayor Reed flipped through the folder, his political smile. Faltering, Principal Warner shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar. "We are not asking for punishment," Miguel clarified, surprising even himself with this deviation from their original plan. "We're asking for acknowledgement, for change, for Riverside to be a place where everyone belongs, not just those who were born here or look a certain way." He paused, then added the words that had come to him during the silent drive to the meeting. "A town cannot move forward if it's always looking back with resentment, and it cannot thrive if it rejects new voices, new perspectives, new energy." The fiaus. Silence that followed felt like a held breath. Then Mayor Reed leaned forward. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Alvarez," he said stiffly. "The board will take these allegations very seriously and conduct a thorough—" "No," the voice came from the back of the room. Eduardo Alvarez stood, his posture military straight despite months of hunched labor. "No more thorough investigations that go nowhere. No more committees. My son has shown extraordinary courage tonight. All these children have." He gestured around the room. "They deserve more than bureaucratic delay tactics." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Mr. Alvarez," Mayor Reed began, a note of warning in his voice. "It's Dr. Alvarez, actually," Eduardo corrected quietly. "I hold a PhD in mechanical engineering, specialized in sustainability solutions for manufacturing, perhaps relevant given Riverside's economic challenges." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of surprise. "The point is," Eduardo continued, "these children have done your job for you. They've documented a problem, presented evidence, and even suggested solutions." He held up the final page of Eliza and Miguel's report. "Implementation should begin immediately." Mayor Reed looked like he might object, but a surprising voice of support came from within his own ranks. Mrs. Winters, the superintendent's wife and a long-standing board member, spoke up. "Edward is right," she said firmly. "We've been turning a blind eye for too long. I motion that we adopt the students' anti-harassment policy immediately and form an oversight committee with student representatives to monitor implementation." The motion was seconded, discussed, and eventually passed, though not unanimously. Miguel noticed that Mayor Reed's vote came reluctantly, his eyes frequently drifting to where his son sat, still silent and watchful. As the meeting adjourned, Miguel found himself surrounded by classmates. Some he recognized from Eliza's documentation, others who had suffered in silence, all offering quiet thanks or respectful nods. The divisions that had seemed so insurmountable were still present, but something fundamental had shifted. Coach Winters approached, clapping a hand on Miguel's shoulder. "That took guts," he said simply. "Did it change anything?" Miguel asked, genuinely uncertain. "That depends," the coach replied, nodding toward the exit where Tyler stood, clearly waiting. "On whether courage is contagious." Miguel excused himself and crossed to where his former tormentor lingered. "You didn't mention me by name," Tyler said without preamble. "You could have." "Would it have helped?" Tyler considered this. "Probably not, but it would have been fair." Miguel shrugged. "I'm not interested in fair. I'm interested in better." "Better," Tyler repeated as if testing the word. "Yeah, maybe." He hesitated, then extended his hand. "My sister's coming to your study group tomorrow. Try not to make her feel too stupid." Miguel accepted the handshake, noting the firmness of Tyler's grip. Everyone feels stupid in calculus sometimes. That's how you know you're learning. It wasn't friendship. That would require more time, more trust, more evidence of genuine change. But it was a beginning, a small stone in the foundation of whatever Riversend might become, if it could break its cycles of fear and blame. As they parted ways, Miguel caught sight of his parents speaking with Dr. Chen and Eliza's family, the unlikely alliance that had formed around their children's courage. His mother was smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time since they'd left Mexico. Perhaps exile could become migration after all. Perhaps Riversend could become home.